If I had known that one sentence at a family reunion table could make everyone look at me like I didn't belong there, I would have never walked through that front door that afternoon. The Miller family reunion was held at my aunt's spacious backyard in suburban Ohio, the kind of place where everything looks perfect on the surface. White folding tents, neatly arranged picnic tables, and the smell of grilled food drifting through the warm summer air. I arrived right on time, wearing a simple blue dress, telling myself it would just be another polite gathering, a few smiles, a few awkward conversations, and then I could leave before sunset. Emily Carter had always been the one in the family who kept things low-key, the one who didn't make a scene, and yet the moment I stepped into the yard, I could feel something was off. Jessica Miller, my older sister, was already there, standing near the drinks table, laughing a little too loudly at something our cousin said. She looked flawless as always, hair perfectly curled, posture confident, the kind of presence that made people naturally gravitate toward her. Everyone seemed to treat her like the center of gravity in the room, like she was the one holding the entire family together. And me, I was just there. A few polite nods, a couple of half-smiles, nothing more. I noticed how Jessica barely looked at me directly, like I was just another guest instead of her sister. It wasn't openly hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was calculated distance, the kind that makes you question whether you're imagining it. I tried to brush it off and help myself to a glass of lemonade, standing near the edge of the crowd, listening to conversations about vacations, new jobs, and school updates. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but underneath it, there was this subtle tension I couldn't quite name. Then I noticed Olivia Miller, Jessica's 7-year-old daughter, sitting on a bench not far from me. She wasn't running around like the other kids. Instead, she kept looking in my direction, as if she was waiting for something or someone had told her to stay close. When she finally walked over, she held her hands together, nervously, and tilted her head like she was trying to remember a line she had been taught. "Aunt Emily," she said softly, and I smiled, crouching slightly to meet her eye level, expecting a normal childlike question. But she didn't smile back. Instead, she hesitated, glanced toward Jessica for just a second, and then back at me. That small glance was enough to make my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. "Do you still help us?" she asked suddenly, her voice innocent but strangely rehearsed. I blinked, confused. "Of course I care about you," I said gently, thinking maybe she meant something simple, like school supplies or visits. But Olivia shook her head slightly, as if that wasn't the answer she was supposed to accept. She looked back again toward Jessica, and that's when I noticed my sister watching us from across the yard, expression unreadable, almost perfectly neutral. Olivia swallowed, then spoke again, louder this time, as if she had finally found the courage to repeat something important. "Mom says you never give back to us." The words didn't sound like they belonged to a child. They landed in the air like something carefully placed, not accidentally spoken. And in that exact moment, the noise of the reunion didn't stop, but it felt like everything around me had shifted just enough for people nearby to start turning their heads in my direction, slowly, one by one, as if the entire afternoon had just changed its shape around those few words. For a few seconds after those words came out of Olivia Miller's mouth, I could not even tell if I had heard them correctly, because the air around the table seemed to keep moving like nothing had happened, yet everything inside me had gone still at the same time. People nearby continued talking. Someone laughed in the distance. A plate clinked softly against another plate, but I could feel the shift in attention like a slow wave spreading outward from our spot. I slowly straightened up from my crouch, looking at Olivia's small face, searching for any sign that she understood what she had just said, but she only looked uncertain now, as if she had delivered something she was not fully allowed to explain. My eyes moved instinctively across the yard, and that was when I saw Jessica Miller still standing near the drinks table, watching us with the same calm expression, almost too calm, like she had already prepared herself for whatever reaction was coming. I felt my throat tighten slightly, not from anger, but from confusion, because the sentence did not feel like something a 7-year-old would naturally say without context. I gently asked Olivia to repeat herself, keeping my voice as steady as possible, and she hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her fingers fidgeting together in a way that made it clear she was nervous. Around us, a few relatives had started to quiet down, pretending not to listen while clearly listening. Olivia glanced back at her mother again, and this time the look was longer, almost like she was silently asking for permission, but Jessica did not move, did not interrupt, did not correct her. She simply observed. That silence alone felt heavier than any explanation could have been. I tried to soften my tone and told Olivia that sometimes adults misunderstand things, that maybe she meant something else, but before I could finish, she shook her head quickly, almost too quickly, as if she had memorized that she was not supposed to disagree. Mom says it all the time, she added quietly, and that single addition made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore, because it confirmed that this was not a one-time comment, but something repeated, something learned. I stood there for a moment, the lemonade I had picked up earlier still untouched in my hand, feeling the weight of several family members now openly looking in our direction. One of my cousins shifted uncomfortably at a nearby table, pretending to adjust a napkin, while still clearly paying attention. I finally turned my head fully toward Jessica, and for the first time, she met my gaze directly. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment, only a composed neutrality that made it impossible to read what she was thinking. I asked her, carefully, what exactly she had told Olivia, keeping my voice low so it would not turn into a public scene, but the question alone seemed to change the atmosphere again, tightening it further. Jessica finally took a slow step closer, still calm, still measured, and said that she had not told Olivia anything she should not know, that children simply notice things adults avoid talking about. Her words were smooth, almost rehearsed, and they landed in a way that made some people around us subtly nod, as if they were already leaning toward her explanation. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, not because I was being attacked directly, but because I could feel the narrative shifting in real time, as if I had suddenly been placed in a version of the story I did not recognize. Olivia stood between us, looking back and forth, her confusion now more visible, as if she had expected someone to resolve what she had started, but no one was stepping in to help her understand it. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer just a misunderstanding between adults, but something that had already been shaped long before I arrived at this reunion. The moment Jessica Miller stepped closer, the space between us at the family reunion felt smaller, even though no one physically moved in except her, and I could sense that the entire group around us was waiting for something to break or clarify, but no one seemed willing to intervene. I kept my focus on her face, trying to read any emotion that would explain what was happening, yet she remained calm in a way that felt almost strategic, as if she had already decided how this conversation would be remembered by everyone standing nearby. I asked her again, more clearly this time, what she had told Olivia Miller, and for a brief moment her eyes flicked toward her daughter before returning to me, a quick motion that most people would have missed, but which made everything feel more intentional. She responded that she had only explained responsibilities within a family, that children notice when people are not present or involved, and that she had not encouraged Olivia to say anything specific. Her voice stayed steady, almost gentle, but the phrasing felt carefully chosen, and I noticed a few relatives subtly nodding as if her explanation already made sense. To them, I felt a growing frustration, not because of what she was saying directly, but because of how quickly the room seemed to accept it without question, as if the weight of reputation was already working in her favor. I looked around and realized that several family members had stopped their casual conversations entirely, and now stood in small clusters, pretending to be busy while clearly listening. Olivia Miller, still standing between us, shifted slightly closer to me, then back again toward her mother, her small hands clasped tightly in front of her, clearly caught in a situation she did not fully understand. I knelt down again to her level and asked softly what she meant when she repeated those words earlier, trying to remove any pressure from her voice. And for a moment, she looked like she wanted to answer honestly, but hesitation took over again as she glanced at Jessica. That glance lasted just a second, but it was enough to make me realize that whatever was happening had already been shaped in advance, not created in this moment. Jessica then spoke again, saying that it was not fair to put a child in the middle of adult misunderstandings, and a few people around us murmured in agreement, as if that statement itself settled the matter. I stood up slowly, feeling the situation shift further away from clarity and closer to something more one-sided, and I could sense my position in the family dynamic subtly changing in real time. The same people who had greeted me politely earlier were now watching me with a more cautious expression, as if evaluating whether I belonged in the version of events that was forming around Jessica's narrative. I tried to explain that I had never been told about any issue involving giving back or responsibility, but my words seemed to land without much impact, as if the framework of belief had already been established before I spoke. Jessica listened without interrupting, then calmly said that maybe communication had simply been inconsistent over time, and that misunderstandings often happened in families where expectations were not openly discussed. It sounded reasonable on the surface, but the way it was delivered made it difficult to challenge without appearing defensive. Olivia remained quiet now, looking down at the ground, and I could see that she no longer seemed sure whether she had said something helpful or something wrong. The reunion continued around us in fragments, people trying to return to normal conversations while still glancing back at our table. But the atmosphere had permanently changed, like a thread had been pulled loose and no one knew how to stitch it back together. I realized then that this was no longer about a single sentence spoken by a child, but about how quickly perception could be shaped when only one version of a story was allowed to sound reasonable in front of everyone watching. The silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself, as if the entire family reunion had shifted into a quieter version of reality where every small sound carried meaning, and I could feel eyes still resting on me, even when people pretended to return to their conversations. Jessica Miller stayed composed, standing a few feet away with her hands relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, while I stood there trying to understand how quickly the situation had been redefined without any clear moment of agreement. Olivia Miller remained between us, no longer speaking, her gaze fixed on the ground, and I noticed how she subtly moved closer to her mother whenever someone walked past, as if seeking stability in something she could recognize. I took a slow breath and tried to reframe what had just happened, telling myself that misunderstandings in families were not unusual, but the discomfort I felt came not from a single comment, but from how easily that comment had been accepted by everyone listening. A few relatives resumed their activities, but their voices were softer now, and every laugh felt slightly delayed, like they were carefully testing whether normal behavior had returned. Jessica eventually broke the silence by casually asking someone nearby about the food preparation, and the shift in tone was immediate, as if she had the ability to redirect the entire atmosphere without needing to address what had just occurred. I watched that happen and realized how quickly group perception could stabilize around the person who spoke last with confidence. I tried again to speak privately with Jessica, asking if we could clarify things without everyone listening. But she responded politely that there was nothing to clarify, only different interpretations of past interactions. The way she said it made it sound reasonable enough that stepping back would feel like overreacting, and I noticed a few people subtly agreeing with her framing. Olivia tugged lightly at Jessica's dress and whispered something I could not hear, and Jessica bent slightly to listen, nodding once before gently telling her to go play with the other children. The interaction was calm, almost routine, but it reinforced the separation between us in a way that felt deliberate even if it was not openly acknowledged. I found myself standing slightly apart from the main group now, holding my drink without drinking it, observing how the reunion continued as if a small emotional fracture had simply been absorbed into the background. A cousin approached me briefly, offering a polite smile and changing the subject to work, but the conversation felt cautious, as if even neutral topics now required careful navigation. I realized that no one was openly taking sides, but the absence of support was beginning to feel like its own form of positioning. Jessica remained visible across the yard, occasionally laughing with relatives, her presence steady and unbothered, which made it harder to challenge the version of events she had indirectly established. I started noticing small details I had ignored earlier, like how often people referenced her reliability, her involvement, her consistency within the family, and how those descriptions quietly reinforced a particular image. It was not that anyone was openly accusing me of anything more, but rather that the narrative space had already been filled in a way that left little room for my perspective to naturally exist. Olivia glanced at me once from a distance while playing, then quickly looked away again, as if unsure whether acknowledgement itself was allowed. I stood there longer than I intended, realizing that the reunion had continued, but the version I was part of no longer felt centered in it, and I could sense that whatever had been introduced earlier was still shaping how every interaction around me would unfold for the rest of the day. As the afternoon at the family reunion slowly continued, I began to notice that nothing had truly returned to normal, even though everyone was acting as if it had. And that quiet contradiction made it harder to tell whether I was overthinking the situation or simply seeing it more clearly than before. Jessica Miller moved through conversations with ease, greeting relatives, smiling at familiar faces, and occasionally touching Olivia Miller's shoulder in a casual, reassuring way that seemed harmless on the surface, yet now felt like part of a larger pattern I could not ignore. I stayed near the edge of the gathering, listening more than speaking, and I realized that the conversations around me had subtly shifted away from any topic that might bring attention back to what had happened earlier. When someone mentioned family contributions or support in a general sense, the discussion quickly changed direction, as if there was an unspoken agreement to avoid anything that might reopen uncertainty. I found myself replaying the earlier moment again and again, not because I doubted what Olivia had said, but because I could not understand how a child's words had been absorbed so quickly into a narrative that seemed to already exist before she spoke them. At one point, Jessica approached a group of relatives I was standing near and casually joined their conversation, speaking about recent family updates and community events, and within minutes the tone around her became lighter again, as if her presence naturally restored balance. No one mentioned the earlier exchange directly, but I could feel how carefully the boundaries of conversation were being drawn around it. Olivia, now playing with other children a short distance away, occasionally looked toward the adults, and I noticed that she no longer spoke as freely as she had earlier, instead watching more than participating. I walked a little further away from the main tables, trying to gather my thoughts, and I realized that the most unsettling part was not the accusation itself, but the way it had become fixed in everyone's understanding without ever being openly examined. When I finally rejoined a small conversation between two cousins, I attempted to casually mention that I felt there might have been a misunderstanding earlier, but their responses were polite and non-committal, as if acknowledging it too directly would create unnecessary discomfort. One of them gently suggested that family situations were often more complicated than they appeared, and that it was sometimes better to let things settle naturally over time. The words were kind, but they also reinforced a sense of distance, as if my perspective was something separate from the accepted reality of the group. Across the yard, Jessica laughed at something someone said, and the sound carried easily through the warm air, blending into the atmosphere in a way that made it hard to believe anything unusual had happened at all. Yet every time I saw her interact with others, I became more aware of how stable her position appeared within the family structure, and how easily that stability influenced the way others interpreted the situation. I began to understand that influence in a family is not always about what is said directly, but about what feels most comfortable for others to believe when no one pushes back strongly enough to challenge it. As the afternoon light started to shift slightly and the gathering moved into a slower rhythm, I remained aware that the earlier moment had not been resolved or clarified, only absorbed into the background of everything else, and that realization stayed with me as I continued moving through conversations that now felt different in ways I could not fully ignore. As the family reunion continued into the late afternoon, I found myself increasingly aware that the atmosphere had not returned to what it was before, even though on the surface everything appeared calm. And that quiet imbalance made every interaction feel slightly more deliberate than before. Jessica Miller moved easily between groups of relatives, her presence steady and familiar, and I noticed how often people naturally leaned toward her conversations, as if she was the default center of attention without needing to claim it. I remained on the outer edges of the gathering, observing more than participating, and I began to see how quickly attention patterns form in a group when no one actively challenges them. Olivia Miller was now playing with a few other children near the lawn, but even from a distance I could tell she was quieter than earlier, occasionally pausing to look toward the adults before returning to her play. At one point, I tried again to speak with Jessica in a calmer setting, waiting until she was briefly alone near the refreshments table, and I asked if we could clarify what had been said earlier so there would be no misunderstanding going forward. She responded without hesitation, maintaining the same composed tone, saying that she believed everything had already been explained as clearly as possible, and that continuing to revisit the topic would only create unnecessary tension within the family. Her answer was polite, structured, and difficult to challenge without appearing like I was refusing closure, and I could feel how easily that framing might influence anyone listening nearby. A couple of relatives passed behind us during the conversation, slowing slightly as they heard fragments, and then continuing on without interruption. But I could sense that even those partial impressions were being absorbed into how people understood the situation. I realized that Jessica did not need to argue aggressively or raise her voice, because the stability of her tone alone was enough to make her position feel more reasonable in a crowded environment. I stepped away again, walking slowly along the edge of the yard, and I noticed how conversations around me had settled into lighter topics, as if the earlier tension had been quietly filed away rather than resolved. Someone mentioned upcoming holidays, another talked about work schedules, and laughter returned in small bursts that felt slightly more cautious than before. Every now and then, I caught fragments of phrases that indirectly referenced responsibility, effort, or family expectations, but they were always general enough to avoid pointing in any direction, yet still close enough to feel connected to what had happened earlier. I began to understand that no single moment of confrontation was needed for a narrative to take shape. Instead, it was the accumulation of small, accepted interpretations that gradually formed a shared understanding. Olivia briefly ran past me while chasing another child, and for a moment our eyes met, but she quickly looked away again, as if unsure whether acknowledgement itself carried meaning she should avoid. That brief interaction stayed with me longer than expected, because it felt like she was now navigating something she did not fully understand but had already been influenced by. As the sun lowered slightly and the shadows across the yard became longer, I remained on the perimeter of the gathering, noticing how effortlessly the group had stabilized around a version of events that did not require further discussion. Jessica continued to appear comfortable within that structure, speaking with relatives as if nothing significant had disrupted the day, and I realized that the most difficult part was not what had been said earlier, but how completely it had been absorbed into everything that followed without resistance. By the time the family reunion moved closer to evening, I could feel a subtle but undeniable distance growing between my experience of the day and the way everyone else seemed to be processing it, as if we were all present in the same physical space, but not entirely sharing the same understanding of what had taken place. Jessica Miller continued to move through the gathering with the same steady ease, greeting relatives, responding to conversations, and occasionally pausing to check on Olivia Miller, whose behavior now appeared more subdued than earlier in the day. I stayed near a quiet corner of the yard, watching interactions unfold without actively joining them, and I began to notice how often people referenced general ideas about communication, expectations, and family responsibilities in a way that felt indirectly connected to earlier events, yet never specific enough to be openly addressed. When I passed by a small group near the food table, I caught fragments of a conversation where someone mentioned how important it was for family members to contribute consistently, and although no names were used, I could sense the way those words subtly aligned with the narrative that had already formed around Jessica's earlier explanation. I stopped for a moment near the edge of the porch, looking across the yard, and realized how effectively a shared understanding can solidify simply through repetition and silence, rather than through direct agreement. Olivia was sitting on a step nearby, no longer actively playing, her attention divided between the ground and the movement of adults around her, and when I slowly approached, she did not immediately look up. I knelt at a respectful distance and asked her gently if she was feeling okay, trying to keep my tone neutral and calm, and after a brief pause she nodded without speaking, as if unsure whether a more detailed response was expected or safe. That hesitation told me more than her words could have, because it suggested that she was now aware of boundaries she had not recognized earlier in the day. I did not press further, but I stayed nearby for a moment, observing how she occasionally glanced toward her mother in the distance, almost instinctively checking for guidance before reacting to anything around her. Jessica, meanwhile, was engaged in conversation with a relative near the center of the yard, her expression relaxed, her posture open, and I noticed how naturally others responded to her presence, reinforcing her position within the group dynamic without any visible effort. As I stood back up, I became aware that my earlier attempts to clarify the situation were no longer part of the active conversation in the room, not because they had been resolved, but because they had already been absorbed into a broader, more stable interpretation that required no further discussion. A cousin briefly joined me near the walkway and asked a light question about my work, but the conversation felt careful, as if avoiding any subject that might reconnect to earlier tension, and I responded in kind, maintaining a neutral tone while observing how quickly the focus of interaction could shift away from discomfort once a new equilibrium had been established. Across the yard, laughter rose again from a different group, slightly louder than before, and I noticed how easily the atmosphere could alternate between moments of warmth and moments of distance without ever fully returning to what it had been at the start of the afternoon. As the light continued to fade and the gathering naturally slowed, I remained aware that nothing had been formally concluded or clarified, yet everything had already been internally categorized by those present in a way that left very little space for reinterpretation. As the family reunion began to wind down and the late afternoon light shifted into a softer evening glow, I could feel that the day had reached a point where nothing new would be openly said, yet everything that mattered had already been quietly decided in the minds of those present. Jessica Miller continued to appear at ease, moving through final conversations with relatives as they began saying their goodbyes, and I noticed how naturally people lingered near her before leaving, as if seeking a final confirmation of the version of the day they had already accepted. I remained slightly apart from the main flow of departures, observing how easily the group transitioned back into normal interactions after hours of subtle tension, and it struck me how quickly collective memory can stabilize when there is no competing narrative strong enough to disrupt it. Olivia Miller stood near her mother now, holding onto her hand more consistently than before, and her earlier hesitation seemed to have settled into quiet compliance, as if the uncertainty she had shown earlier had been gently contained by the structure around her. I watched Jessica speak briefly with a few relatives who were preparing to leave, her tone warm and casual, and I realized that at no point during these final exchanges did anyone return to the earlier moment directly, even indirectly, as if it had been absorbed into something unspoken but permanent. When I approached the driveway area where a few family members were gathering their belongings, I exchanged polite farewells and brief conversations, but I could sense a careful distance in the way people interacted with me, not unfriendly, but cautious in a way that suggested the earlier impression had not disappeared. One relative mentioned how important it was for families to maintain understanding even during disagreements, and although it was said generally, I understood how easily such statements could reinforce the interpretation that had already taken shape. Jessica passed by me shortly after, pausing just long enough to say goodbye with a calm expression and a simple thank you for coming, and the neutrality of her tone carried a sense of finality that made it clear no further discussion was expected or necessary. Olivia stood slightly behind her, looking up briefly at me before quickly looking away again, and that small gesture felt like a reflection of how much had been decided for her without words needing to be spoken. As people began leaving in small groups, the yard slowly emptied, and the sounds of conversation faded into the distance, replaced by the quieter presence of folding chairs being stacked and tables being cleared. I stayed for a moment longer than most, not because there was anything left to resolve, but because I was trying to understand how an entire afternoon of interaction could settle into such a defined shape without any formal conclusion. Jessica and Olivia eventually walked toward their car with other family members nearby, and I noticed how naturally others assisted them with small tasks, reinforcing a sense of familiarity and belonging that felt fully restored by the end of the event. When their car finally pulled away, I remained standing near the edge of the driveway, watching as the last traces of the gathering disappeared into the fading light. The house behind me felt quieter now, almost unchanged physically, yet completely different in meaning compared to when I first arrived. I realized then that nothing had been resolved in an explicit way, no clarification had been made in a shared sense, yet the version of events that would remain in everyone's memory had already been established, and it would continue to exist without needing to be spoken about again. On the drive home after the family reunion, the silence in the car felt heavier than anything that had happened during the day, not because anything new was said, but because everything that had been left unspoken seemed to finally settle into place in a way that could no longer be avoided. I sat in the passenger seat looking out at the passing streets of suburban Ohio, watching familiar neighborhoods fade into the distance, and I kept replaying the earlier moments over and over again, not searching for a different outcome, but trying to understand how quickly perception had become something fixed and shared. The sunlight was fading into a soft orange glow, and the road ahead felt longer than it should have, even though nothing about the distance had changed. Jessica Miller drove without speaking much, occasionally adjusting her grip on the steering wheel, her expression calm and composed, as if the day had ended exactly as she expected it would. Olivia Miller sat quietly in the back seat, no longer speaking, her attention focused somewhere between the window and her lap, and I noticed how different she seemed compared to earlier in the afternoon, as if the energy she had carried at the beginning of the reunion had been gradually replaced by something more restrained. At one point, I considered saying something to break the silence, something simple that might reopen a neutral space between us, but every possible sentence I thought of felt like it would only confirm that there was still something unresolved, and I was not sure anyone else in the car would acknowledge that in the same way. The memory of the reunion no longer felt like a sequence of events, but more like a structure that had already been finalized, where each moment had found its place regardless of how I personally understood it. When we reached a stoplight, I briefly glanced toward Jessica, and she looked forward with the same steady focus, neither avoiding nor inviting conversation, simply maintaining the quiet certainty of someone who believed nothing more needed to be addressed. In the rearview mirror, I could see Olivia shifting slightly, adjusting her posture, and for a brief moment she looked up, meeting my reflection before quickly looking away again, as if unsure whether that connection was appropriate anymore. That small gesture stayed with me longer than anything else from the day, because it reflected a change that had not been spoken about, but had clearly taken effect. As we continued driving, I realized that the most lasting part of the entire experience was not the sentence that had been spoken at the reunion, but the way it had been absorbed into a collective understanding that no longer required verification or discussion. By the time we turned onto our street and the familiar outline of home appeared ahead, I understood that the event had already been concluded in the only way that mattered socially, even if it remained unresolved internally, and that realization carried a quiet weight that stayed with me even as the car finally slowed and the day came to an end.